Right now, if you cut your hand, you'd probably grab a bandage and forget about it. But less than a century ago, that same cut could kill you. A sore throat could mean your heart would fail. A toothache could rot your jaw and end your life. For thousands of years, humanity lived in a world where invisible killers ruled every home, every battlefield, and every birth. This is a story of life before antibiotics, a time when death could come from the smallest wound. A world where a simple scratch from a rusty nail could be a death sentence. A sore throat could kill you, and something as small as a toothache might spread infection through your entire body. This was life before antibiotics, a time when human survival balanced on the edge of chance, when even the healthiest person could be brought down by the smallest wound. Before the 20th century, medicine had no miracle drugs. Doctors had tools, herbs, and prayers, but when infection struck, they were helpless. For thousands of years, humanity lived under the shadow of invisible killers, bacteria we could not see, could not fight, and could not understand. This reality shaped every aspect of daily life, creating a world where fear, disease, and infection was constant, and survival depended as much on luck as on strength. To appreciate how fragile life once was, consider something as ordinary as a child running barefoot through the fields. If that child stepped on a sharp stone or thorn, the wound might seem minor. But within days, if bacteria entered the bloodstream, the child could develop a fever, swelling, and unbearable pain. Parents would watch helplessly as the infection spread, sometimes turning into sepsis, which almost always meant death. There was no cure, no hospital intervention, only the prayers of a desperate family. Women, too, live with unique dangers. Childbirth, which today is usually a moment of joy, was one of the most perilous events in a woman's life. A small tear during delivery or an unclean instrument used by a midwife could introduce deadly bacteria. What we now know as postpartum infections or childbed fever claimed countless lives. Hospitals and homes alike were filled with the cries of newborns who would never know their mothers. In some communities, women whisper about childbirth as though it were walking a narrow bridge between life and death. Men were not spared either. The life of a worker, farmer, or soldier was filled with risks. A cut from a farming tool, a wound from a battlefield sword, or even a blister from long hours of labor could become infected. Once infection set in, options were grim. Amputation was often the only hope, but it came with its own dangers. Without antibiotics, cutting off a limb did not guarantee survival, because the infection could spread into the blood regardless. Surgeons relied on crude tools and no anesthesia in earlier centuries, so the procedure itself could be deadly. The tragedy of life before antibiotics was that people understood the symptoms but not the causes. They saw wounds fester, fevers rise, and skin turn black with gangrene, but they could not comprehend the invisible world of microbes. Some believed infections were caused by imbalances of the body's humors, others by foul air, or as punishment from higher powers. Treatments reflected these beliefs. Patients were subjected to bloodletting, purges, or given mixtures of herbs. Sometimes these remedies brought slight relief, but often they only weakened the body further. In cities where sanitation was poor, infections spread like wildfire. Streets filled with waste, water sources polluted, and crowded housing created a breeding ground for disease. A child with minor cough could deteriorate into pneumonia, which was almost always fatal. Tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and diphtheria swept through entire families, leaving behind orphans and grief. In the absence of antibiotics, outbreaks of infectious diseases could empty villages, halt armies, and cripple economies. Even dentistry was a matter of life and death. A toothache, something we treat with a simple antibiotic course today, could turn into an abscess. That abscess could spread infection to the jaw, then to the bloodstream, eventually killing the patient. People knew the dangers, which is why tooth extraction was often done quickly and brutally, in the hope that removing the problem tooth would save a life. But without sterile instruments or antibiotics, even extractions could be fatal. The fragility of life extended into childhood. Parents often did not expect all their children to survive. Infant mortality rates were staggering. A child with whooping cough, an infected ear, or even untreated measles could die within days. Families carried grief as a constant companion, and communities developed rituals around mourning because loss was inevitable. Death was not distant, but present in every home, every season, every generation. Wars further exposed the vulnerability of the human body to infection. More soldiers in history died from infections than from combat wounds. An arrow, bullet, or sword might not kill instantly, but the infection that followed often did. Accounts from ancient battles, medieval wars, and even conflict of the 19th century describe men lingering for days with fevers, rotting wounds, and unbearable pain until death came as a release. Commanders and generals knew they could lose more men to disease and infection than enemy weapons. Surgery, which we think of today as life-saving, was once more dangerous than doing nothing at all. Without antiseptics, sterile techniques, or antibiotics, surgical wounds frequently became infected. Amputations performed to save a soldier or accident victim often led to gangrene. The smell of infection in hospital wards was overwhelming and survival rates were low. Many patients preferred to die untreated rather than undergo surgery that offered little hope of recovery. What made this world especially cruel was the randomness of survival. One person might cut their hand and recover without incident, while another would die from a nearly identical wound. A child might survive pneumonia while their sibling succumbed. Entire families could live through childbirth and illness unharmed, while their neighbors were devastated by infections. With no clear understanding of bacteria, people often attribute survival or death to fate, chance, or divine will. Yet, despite the constant threat, people persevered. They learned to live with fear, creating remedies, rituals, and traditions to protect themselves. They boiled herbs, applied poultices, and prayed. Communities developed healers, shamans, or physicians who offered hope, even when cures were out of reach. Their efforts, though often ineffective, show the resilience of human beings who refuse to surrender to despair. The fragile body of humanity before antibiotics shaped culture and society. Death at a young age was common, so families often had many children, knowing some would not survive. Life expectancy was far shorter, not because people aged quickly, but because so many died young from infections. Literature, art, and religion reflected the ever-present shadow of death. Writings from the past are filled with prayers of protection from fevers, laments for lost children, and gratitude for every day of survival. Even as science advanced, the shadow of infection remained. By the 19th century, doctors had begun to understand germs thanks to pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, who advocated for cleanliness in surgery. For some, the procedure brought relief. For others, it opened the door to deadly infection. The age of infection shaped entire cultures. Communities built rituals around cleansing and protection, even when they did not understand science. Religious ceremonies, protective amulets, and traditional remedies all reflected humanity's attempt to fight unseen enemies. Art and literature were filled with references to fever, mourning, and untimely death, because these experiences were universal. The fragility of life was not hidden or rare. It was the background against which everyone lived. Travel and exploration, which opened the world during the early modern era, also spread infections to new lands. Colonists carried diseases into communities that had never encountered them before, with devastating effects. Native populations across the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific were ravaged by infections they had no immunity against. In many places, entire societies collapsed under the weight of disease introduced by foreign contact. The age of exploration was also the age of infection, where the movement of people meant the movement of death. Even as scientific understanding began to grow in the 19th century, fear of infection never left. The discoveries of Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister began to reveal the hidden world of germs and the importance of cleanliness. Surgeons started washing hands, sterilizing tools, and using antiseptics, and death rates began to decline. Yet knowledge alone was not enough. Once infection entered the body, even the cleanest surgery and the best care could not reverse it. Families still lost loved ones daily, and doctors remained powerless in the face of bacteria that multiplied unchecked. The age of infection left a deep mark on human memory. Generations lived with the constant presence of death, and entire societies were shaped by their struggle against unseen enemies. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and cruel. The body was a battlefield, and bacteria almost always won. People lived not with the expectation of safety, but with the acceptance of danger. It was a world where medicine could ease pain but not cure, where love was shadowed by loss, and where survival was never guaranteed. This was the reality of the age of infection, an era when humanity existed in constant fear of wounds, fevers, and the silent spread of disease. It was a time when the smallest illness could bring down the strongest person, when families lived with grief as a constant companion, and when the hope of healing was fragile at best. Only with the dawn of antibiotics would this long, dark age finally begin to lift. Everything changed in the 20th century with the discovery of antibiotics. For thousands of years, human beings had lived under the shadow of infections, powerless against bacteria that kill without mercy. Generations upon generations buried loved ones from wounds, childbirth, fevers, and diseases we now treat with single course of pills. But in 1928, a quiet revolution began in a London laboratory. Alexander Fleming, a bacteriologist, returned from holiday to find something unusual in one of his petri dishes. On the plate where he had been growing colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria, a patch of mold had accidentally landed. Instead of growing alongside the bacteria, the mold created a clear ring where no bacteria survived. Fleming realized that this mold, later identified as Penicillium notatum, released a substance that destroyed bacteria. That discovery became penicillin, the world's first true antibiotic. At first, the significance of this moment went largely unnoticed. Fleming published his findings, but producing penicillin in large amounts proved difficult. For years, the discovery lingered in scientific journals, a fascinating curiosity, but not yet a practical medicine. It was only during World War II that penicillin's potential was fully realized. Researchers in Britain and the United States developed methods to mass produce it, and suddenly, soldiers who would once have died from infected wounds could be saved. On the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, penicillin became a secret weapon. Soldiers with gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, or infected burns survived in numbers never seen before in the history of warfare. Surgeons who had once watched helplessly as gangrene claimed their patients now had a tool that turned certain death into recovery. By the end of the war, penicillin was being hailed as a miracle, and its impact was clear. Medicine had entered a new age. The discovery of penicillin was not the end but the beginning. Other antibiotics soon followed. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, became the first effective treatment for tuberculosis, a disease that had terrorized humanity for centuries. Tetracyclines, erythromycin, and many others quickly expanded the arsenal against bacterial infections. Suddenly, diseases that had filled hospital wards and graveyards were being treated and cured. Infections that had once swept through communities unchecked were now manageable, even preventable. The effect on human life expectancy was dramatic. Before antibiotics, the average person could not count on living past 40 or 50. Childhood illnesses claimed countless lives, and mothers died frequently in childbirth. With antibiotics, survival rates soared. Surgeries that had once been life-threatening because of infection risk became routine. Complex operations, organ transplants, and advanced medical procedures became possible only because antibiotics could control infection. For ordinary families, the change was profound. Parents who once feared losing a child to pneumonia or scarlet fever could now expect their children to grow up. Women entered childbirth with far greater safety. A man injured at work could expect to heal instead of facing amputation or death. The constant shadow of infection that had haunted humanity for millennia began to lift. But it is important to remember that the age before antibiotics is not ancient history. Less than a century ago, people lived in terror of infections that we barely think about today. Grandparents alive now may still remember funerals for siblings lost to strep throat or scarlet fever. Medical history books describe hospitals filled with rows of patients gasping for air from pneumonia, with no treatment available. The transformation brought by antibiotics is recent, and that makes it even more remarkable. Antibiotics did more than save lives. They changed the way humans understood health, medicine, and possibility. With infections controlled, doctors and scientists could turn their attention to new challenges. Vaccines, advanced surgeries, cancer treatments, and organ transplants all became feasible because antibiotics stood guard against the ever-present danger of bacterial infection. Without antibiotics, the modern medical world we know today simply could not exist. The cultural impact was just as significant. Hope replaced despair. Parents no longer expected to lose multiple children. Soldiers returned home from wars that would once have killed them. The fragility of life eased, and societies grew more confident in science and medicine. What had once been prayers whispered in desperation turned into prescriptions written with confidence. Entire generations grew up without knowing the constant dread of dying from a simple cut or cough. Yet, even as antibiotics ushered in a golden age of medicine, they carried with them a lesson about fragility. The miracle they represented was powerful, but it was not invincible. From the very beginning, scientists noticed that bacteria could adapt and develop resistance. Fleming himself warned in his Nobel Prize speech in 1945 that misuse of penicillin could lead to resistant bacteria. His warning proved prophetic. Overuse of antibiotics in medicine and agriculture has allowed resistant strains to emerge, threatening to return humanity to a world where infections once again claim lives freely. This reminder underscores just how extraordinary the discovery of antibiotics was, and how easily their power can be undermined. For millennia, human beings endured the relentless suffering of infections. Families buried children. Soldiers died from minor wounds. Mothers were lost to childbirth, and entire communities were devastated by diseases we now consider minor. Antibiotics changed all of that in a single century. To lose them would be to risk falling back into the age of infection, an age most of us can hardly imagine, but that defined nearly all of human history. The dawn of antibiotics represents one of the greatest turning points in human history. It is not simply a medical story. It is a story of survival, of progress, and of hope. It is a story of how humanity, after thousands of years of helplessness, finally gained the power to fight back against the invisible enemies that had ruled our lives. Looking back, it is almost impossible to comprehend the difference. In one era, every cut, every cough, every birth carried the risk of death. In the next, those same risks could be managed, treated, and often eliminated. The discovery of antibiotics drew a sharp line between two worlds, the world of fear and fragility, and the world of hope and healing. Few moments in history can claim to have changed so much for so many in such a short time. Even today, when we swallow a pill for strep throat or take a course of antibiotics for a wound, we are benefiting from that revolution. The ease with which we access these medicines can make us forget the enormity of what they represent. They are more than drugs. They are the difference between a world where life was fragile and uncertain, and a world where life can be preserved, extended, and protected. Life before antibiotics was a fragile existence. Every cut, every cough, every birth carried the risk of death. Entire families lived with the knowledge that loss was inevitable, and every day of survival felt like a victory. But life after antibiotics became something new, safer, longer, and filled with possibilities that earlier generations could not even dream of. And while we live in a world where medicine often feels invincible, the truth remains clear. Antibiotics are one of the greatest miracles of modern science. They represent not only a cure, but a turning point in the human story. They remind us of the darkness we emerged from, and they warn us not to take their power for granted. The dawn of hope they brought must be cherished, protected, and preserved, for without them, humanity risks returning to the age when every breath, every wound, and every moment of life could be stolen by infection.